By the end of this video, you will know exactly which insects people eat in every part of the world, what they actually taste like, and why over 2 billion people already eat them as a normal part of their diet. This is the most complete breakdown of edible insects you will find anywhere. From ant larvae sold as caviar to grubs eaten straight out of a rotting tree, every single one of these has a different origin, a different flavor, and a different culture behind it. By the time this ends, nothing on this list will surprise you anymore. This information is more useful than it sounds. Insects already feed over 2 billion people across Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And global food companies are racing to scale insect protein because it uses a fraction of the water, land, and feed that cattle or pigs require. If you travel almost anywhere outside North America or Western Europe, you will eventually be offered something on this list, whether it is a market stall in Oaxaca, a street cart in Seoul, or a roadside vendor in Bangkok. Knowing what you are looking at, where it comes from, and how it is traditionally prepared changes the entire experience from intimidating to genuinely interesting. And with insect protein bars, flowers, and snacks now sold in regular grocery stores across the West, this is no longer a niche curiosity. It is quietly becoming part of how the world is going to eat in the next few decades. Crickets are the most widely eaten insect on the planet, and the easiest entry point into this entire category. There are more than 2,000 documented species of edible insects worldwide, and crickets sit at the center of almost every modern attempt to commercialize insect food. Farming crickets for protein requires only a tiny fraction of the land and water needed to raise cattle, and pound for pound, crickets convert feed into usable protein far more efficiently than any traditional livestock animal. Roasted crickets have a dry, nutty flavor that most people compare to popcorn or sunflower seeds. With almost none of the bitterness people expect from insects, today they are ground into a fine flour and used in protein bars, pasta, and chips sold in regular supermarkets across the United States and Europe, because the flavor is mild and the texture is crunchy rather than slimy. Crickets are usually the first insect recommended to anyone trying entomophagy for the first time. The next one looks nothing like a cricket, and it comes with a side of lime and chili. Chapulines are toasted grasshoppers. And in the state of Oaxaca, Mexico, they are not a novelty food. They are a staple snack sold by the kilo in open-air markets, the same way you would buy peanuts or chips. The tradition goes back to the Zapotic civilization, long before the Spanish arrived, and farmers actually welcomed the grasshoppers because they swarm onto alfalfa and bean crops as pests. Instead of spraying them with chemicals, farmers harvest them by hand at dawn, while the insects are still slow from the cold. They are toasted in a hot pan with garlic, lime juice, and chili, which gives them a flavor that is salty, tangy, and slightly smoky, closer to a seasoned chip than anything resembling a bug. The texture is crunchy on the outside with almost nothing inside, similar to biting into a dried shrimp shell. In Oaxaca, you will find them stuffed into tacos, sprinkled over quesadillas, or eaten straight from a paper cone as street food. But the next one is not eaten for taste at all. It is eaten because it can mean survival. The mopane worm is the caterpillar of the emperor moth, and it feeds almost exclusively on the leaves of the mopane tree across Zimbabwe, Botswana, Namibia, and South Africa. After the rainy season, entire communities head into the bush to harvest them by hand, and the trade has grown into a multi-million-dollar informal industry, much of it run by women who sell the dried worms in markets across the region. A single mopane worm contains roughly 3 times the protein of an equivalent amount of beef by dry weight, which is part of why it has remained a critical food source through decades of drought and economic hardship. They are typically boiled, then sun-dried, then fried or stewed with onions and tomatoes before eating. The texture is chewy, almost like dried meat jerky, with an earthy flavor that absorbs whatever spices it is cooked with. In southern Africa, dried mopane worms are sold and traded across borders the same way other regions trade dried fish or beans. Now compare that to one of the oldest foods on Earth, eaten raw straight out of the ground. The witchetty grub is the larva of a moth that burrows into the roots of the witchetty bush across the Australian outback, and Aboriginal Australians have eaten it for tens of thousands of years, making it one of the longest continuously eaten foods in human history. Finding them requires reading subtle signs in the dirt and roots that only experienced foragers can spot. Since the grubs live entirely underground until they mature, Eaten raw, the grub tastes mild and slightly nutty, similar to almonds, with a texture closer to soft scrambled egg than anything resembling a worm. Roasted briefly over hot coals, the skin crisps up and the flavor shifts toward something closer to roasted chicken skin or peanut butter. In the desert environment of Central Australia, where fat and protein sources are scarce, a single grub can provide a meaningful amount of both, which is exactly why it became such a reliable survival food for so long. It remains a defining symbol of traditional Aboriginal bush food today. Here's one most people have never heard of, and chefs actually call it caviar. Escamoles are the larvae and pupae of a specific species of ant that lives at the base of the maguey and agave plants in central Mexico, and they are considered one of the most prized delicacies in the entire country. Harvesting them is dangerous and labor-intensive, since collectors have to dig directly into the ant nest while avoiding the colony's aggressive bites, and a single nest only yields a small amount of usable larvae. The Aztecs ate escamoles centuries before the Spanish conquest, and today the dish has moved upscale, often selling for more per kilo than premium cuts of beef. The flavor is rich, buttery, and slightly nutty, with a delicate texture that breaks apart easily, which is exactly why chefs nicknamed it Mexican caviar. It is traditionally sautéed in butter with onion and served wrapped in a fresh tortilla, sometimes alongside a simple salsa to cut through the richness. Because the harvest window is short and the supply is limited, escamoles remain one of the most expensive insect dishes in the world. The next one comes from a completely different industry: silk, beyond DEGIR, silkworm, pupae. And they exist because of South Korea's silk industry, where silkworm cocoons are boiled to extract the thread, leaving the pupae inside as a byproduct instead of waste. Rather than throwing them away, vendors began steaming and seasoning them decades ago, and they have since become one of the most recognizable street snacks in the country, sold from steaming carts in markets and near subway stations. The smell is the first thing that surprises newcomers. It is often described as earthy or similar to wet soil, which can be off-putting before the first bite. The taste itself is closer to nutty and slightly bitter, with a soft, almost mushy texture inside a thin outer shell that pops slightly when bitten. For many Koreans, beyond-a-ji is a nostalgic childhood snack rather than an exotic dare, the same way someone in another country might feel about a bag of roasted peanuts. It is also sold canned in regular grocery stores, making it one of the most commercially available insect foods anywhere in Asia. Now here's one that's eaten alive. Straight out of a rotting tree, the sago grub is the larva of the sago palm weevil, and it is harvested from inside the rotting trunks of sago palm trees across Papua New Guinea, Borneo, and parts of the wider Pacific. Communities cut down a mature palm, let it sit for several weeks until it begins to rot, then split it open to find dozens of fat, wriggling grubs feeding inside. By weight, sago grubs can be over half fat, making them one of the most calorie-dense insect foods on this entire list, which matters enormously in rainforest regions where other reliable protein sources can be hard to come by. They are traditionally eaten raw, often while still moving, with a soft, creamy texture that some compare to a thick, fatty piece of bacon without the smoke. Some communities also roast them over an open fire, which firms up the skin and gives the inside a richer, slightly nuttier flavor. For many indigenous groups in these regions, sago grubs are not a delicacy. They are a core part of staying fed. This next one isn't really eaten for the meat at all. It's eaten for the smell. The giant water bug, known locally as mahangda in Thailand, is one of the strangest entries on this list because most people who eat it are not actually after the meat inside. They are after the intense aroma the insect produces, which gets crushed and blended directly into chili pastes, like nam prik manda. The smell is powerful and complex, often compared to a mix of shrimp paste and overripe cheese, and a tiny amount can flavor an entire batch of paste. Used whole, the bug itself has a firm, slightly crunchy body, but the texture is secondary to what it brings to a dish. Markets across Thailand sell them both live and already prepared into paste form, and the price reflects how essential the aroma is considered to authentic regional cooking. For a lot of visitors, this is the insect that proves entomophagy is not always about replacing meat. Sometimes it is closer to using an extremely potent spice. Now picture an entire village waiting for one single night of rain, because that's when this next one shows up. Flying termites, known as elates, only appear for a short window each year. Right after the first heavy rains soften the soil across Central and East Africa in countries like the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Uganda, Nigeria, and Zambia. Communities know exactly when to expect the swarm and set up lights at night specifically to attract them, since termites are drawn straight toward bright sources after they leave their underground colonies. Once collected, the wings are removed by hand, and the bodies are roasted or fried in their own natural fat with no oil needed at all. The flavor is described as buttery and nutty, very close to popcorn, and the texture is light and crisp rather than chewy. Because the swarm only lasts a few nights a year, the harvest becomes a genuine community event, with families gathering together in the dark to collect as many as possible before the season ends. In many of these regions, termite season is treated less like foraging and more like an annual seasonal celebration. And this next one is actually named in two of the world's major religions. Desert locusts have been eaten across the Middle East and North Africa for thousands of years, and they are specifically named as permitted food in both Jewish and Islamic dietary law, making them one of the only insects with that level of religious documentation. Historically, locust swarms destroyed entire harvests, wiping out crops across huge regions in a matter of days. So eating them was as much a practical response to a plague as it was a food choice. Today they are typically dried, salted, and eaten as a crunchy snack. Similar in texture to a fried shrimp once the legs and wings are removed. The flavor is mild and slightly earthy on its own, which is why most vendors season them heavily with spice blends, lime, or chili before selling them in markets across countries like Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and parts of North Africa. Despite their reputation as agricultural disasters, locusts remain one of the most historically and religiously documented insects ever eaten by humans. The last one isn't eaten for protein at all. It's eaten for something sweet. Honeypot ants are not actually a separate species, so much as a special role inside certain ant colonies, found in the deserts of Australia and parts of the southwestern United States. Specific worker ants, called repletes, are fed huge amounts of nectar by the rest of the colony until their abdomens swell into a translucent, golden sac of liquid honey, essentially turning them into living storage containers for the entire nest. Aboriginal Australian communities have harvested these ants directly from underground nests for thousands of years, gently pulling them out and biting off the swollen abdomen to release the sweet liquid inside, which tastes remarkably close to actual honey. Unlike almost everything else on this list, honeypot ants are eaten purely as a treat rather than a protein source, closer to a piece of candy found in the desert than a meal, because harvesting them requires digging deep into a nest without destroying the colony. It remains a skill passed down through generations, rather than something done commercially. If you rank these from easiest to most extreme, crickets sit clearly at the beginner end. Since the flavor is mild and the texture is just crunchy, nothing slimy or shocking about it. Chapulines and termites come next, both seasoned heavily and closer to a salty snack than anything that feels like eating an insect. Beyondagi and locust sit in the middle. Since the smell or the religious history adds a layer of unfamiliarity, even though the taste itself is mild. Mopane, worms, and witchetty grubs move further out, both eaten more for survival and tradition than flavor alone. Right before the extreme end sits the giant water bug, which most people never actually eat directly at all. And at the most extreme end is the sago grub, eaten raw and still moving, which is about as far from a Western diet as food gets. But here is the twist that actually surprises people. The single most expensive, most prized insect dish on this entire list is not the wildest one. It is escamoles, the so-called Mexican caviar, which sells for more per kilo than many premium cuts of beef. The most luxurious bug on Earth isn't extreme. It's subtle, so that is the full picture of insects eaten around the world. From a humble cricket farmed for protein bars to ant larvae sold as a luxury delicacy worth more than steak. Different regions, different reasons, but the same basic idea. Insects have fed people reliably for thousands of years, long before anyone called it entomophagy. Which one of these have you actually tried? Or would you actually try? Was it the crickets, the chapulines, Or are you brave enough to go for the sago grub? Did I miss one that you think deserves a spot on this list? Let me know in the comments, because I read every single one. If this video gave you something new to think about, hit the like button and subscribe if you want the next deep dive into food most people never look at twice. See you in the next one.